Hello, everybody. I'm Helena Cobban, the president of Just World Educational, and I'd like to welcome you to this 8th session in our 10-part webinar series, Commonsense on Syria. Today, we'll be learning more about the situation of the 500,000 or so Palestinian refugees in Syria, many of whose families have lived there since the Nakba of 1948. And today, for the first time, we'll have 3 expert panelists on the webinar. We have Dr. Waddah al-Khatib, a Palestinian who grew up in Syria and now heads the Cultural Studies Department at Damascus University, who is with us from his home quarantine in Damascus. Hello, Waddah.
Hi, Helena. It's nice to be with you today.
Great to have you with us. And we have Dr. Faedah Totah, a Palestinian-American anthropologist who teaches at Virginia Commonwealth University. She's with us from Richmond, Virginia. Hello, Faedah.
Hi, Helena. Thank you for having me.
It's great to have you with us. And finally, Ambassador Peter Ford, who for many years was the chief emissary of the UN relief agency UNRWA to the Arab states. And before that, had been Britain's ambassador to Damascus. Peter is back with us from Northern England for this session of the webinar. Hello, Peter.
Hi, everyone. Good to be with you.
Now, I want to welcome all our attendees here on the webinar today. We have thus far 87 and counting. We usually get well over 100, so we're looking forward to maybe having some more people join us. Thanks for tuning in. As you probably know by now, you can communicate with the Just World elves who are working behind the scenes here by using the chat button that's at the bottom of your Zoom screen. The elves can answer any technical questions you have, and they will also be queuing up and reviewing any substantive questions you want to pose to the panelists during the Q&A session that we'll have in the latter portion of the webinar. We're delighted that our chief elf is our distinguished board member, Dr. Alice Rothschild, who will put in an appearance a little later. So if you want to ask a question of the panelists, please submit it via the chat box. Please word it succinctly and have it be an actual question. Our elves do not have the time to be reading through long rants. We also ask you to keep your questions to the topic of today's session. So first, I'll turn to you, Waddah, and ask you what it was like growing up Palestinian in Syria.
Good evening, everyone. Being a Palestinian in Syria, growing up in the 70s and 80s of the past century, initially, until you begin to establish your identity, you don't get a sense of you being different from your classmates, from people in the neighborhood. I actually happen to be one of the many Palestinians who did not live in one of the refugee camps in Syria. This is a fact that people don't know perhaps about life in Syria, is that many Palestinians lived outside the refugee camps in the city of Damascus or in other major cities. So it was basically growing up as a Syrian kid. You go to public schools, you don't get any treatment that is different in registering for school just for being Palestinian. Of course, you can go to the UNRWA schools, the United Nations Work and Relief Agency for the Refugees of Palestine. They had a school system in Syria for many Palestinians that would go from KG1 to the 12th grade. But you would go to school and you would not really notice that you were a Palestinian. Perhaps for me, the first time that I did become conscious of that was in 1973, when the war erupted, the 1973 war in the Middle East. And some people started talking about, optimistically, obviously, about Palestinians going back to their homes and towns and cities in Palestine as a result of the war. So perhaps that time was the first time that I inquired from my parents about what does it mean to be Palestinian, and got the narrative that a Palestinian refugee would get from his parents about how we happen to be here, where we're originally from, how we belong to two places at the same time, and how our very sense of identity is constructed around the idea of return. Now, other than that, of course, you know, sometimes when somebody of my generation looks at our lives, we feel like a Forrest Gump type of personalities. We lived through the 1973 war, the 1982 invasion of Israeli invasion of Lebanon. We've been through the intifadas of various types, and each one of those events kind of contributed to our sense of identity and our sense of belonging, or at times not belonging. Now in Syria, we have a very unique situation for Palestinian refugees. They're treated by law almost as equals to Syrian citizens. This is the result of a law that was passed in 1956 with the only democratically elected parliament in the history of Syria that passed a law that considered every Palestinian refugee living in Syria at the time and their descendants as being as having rights that are very similar to Syrian citizens. We get universal healthcare like Syrian citizens. We go to public schools. We go to universities, pay the same tuition fees as Syrians. I was nominated to the Fulbright scholarship by Damascus University, who hired me as a teaching assistant. And so based on merit, my being Palestinian was not something that prevented me from actually enjoying many of the rights that Syrians have. A couple of things that we don't usually get that the Syrian citizen gets are getting a chance to work at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which is strictly for Syrians, and also obviously participating in political life, elections, whatever type of elections we're talking about, whether be they local or national. And also, there are certain restrictions on property owning. You can own a family house, you can own a business, but you cannot own multiple properties by law in Syria. Overall, Syrians as a people view Palestinians as an extension of them. I mean, I'm not talking about, specific cases where some people may feel different from that, but the vast majority of Syrians feel that Palestinians are naturally just an extension of Syria. To put this in perspective, I mean, distance between Damascus, the capital of Syria, and Jerusalem is shorter than distance between, much shorter than distance between, say, Washington, D.C. and New York, or New York and Boston. In many cases, families in the pre-modern age and before, World War I, and the fall of the Ottoman Empire, families of northern Palestine would just cross, the River Jordan or cross the mountains into Damascus and vice versa. So this is the type of life that we've led. Of course, punctuated naturally by all these events that have shaped a great deal of who we are and what we are. It's very difficult to explain what it meant to live through the 1982 invasion of Lebanon, with having friends from Damascus and from the refugee camps who were in Lebanon and who never got back. It's very difficult to explain how we felt when the Madrid peace process started, and then how we feel about it now. So it's a story of hope, perhaps, and a great deal of despair, but never losing a sense of focus on who we are. I think I should probably stop at this point.
That's great. Thank you so much. Yeah, that really, I think, explained a lot. We'll have a lot more questions to come back and ask you later, I'm sure. Now, I'm sorry, I do have to move to Peter. Well, actually, I'm delighted to have Peter with his expertise, who's going to give us a few facts and figures about the Palestinian refugees in Syria, or at least the ones registered with UNRWA, for whom UNRWA has responsibility. So over to you, Peter.
Well, first, a little bit of history. The Palestinians fled in their thousands to Syria from Palestine in 1948. And a couple of years after that, the international agency, UNRWA, the UN Agency for Palestine Refugees, was set up. And UNRWA provided essential services for these refugees, essentially education and healthcare, and some help with food for the most needy. And UNRWA has continued to supply these services ever since. The number of Palestinians has grown, obviously, over the years, as you see on this display. UNRWA calculates that there are 438,000 refugees registered with UNRWA. Not all Palestinians in Syria are registered. A number married Syrians and have kind of slipped into Syrian society. But we can say that broadly there are close to 500,000 Palestinians in Syria. The number is down from 2011. UNRWA say that in 2011, when the recent conflict kicked off, the number was 527,000. So you see that many thousands have fled, many, approximately 30,000 to Lebanon, and approximately 17,000 to Jordan. Palestinians, if that's possible, have arguably suffered even more than Syrians, people with Syrian nationality, because they have faced even more displacement. UNRWA reckoned that about 60% of Palestine refugees in Syria have been displaced at least once, and in many cases more than once. And this is possibly a reflection of the fact that the camps, the 9 refugee camps in Syria, have been battlefields and have become focuses of the conflict. These 9 camps are spread mainly in the western part of the country, essentially in Damascus and its surroundings, in the south, Deraa, in the north, in Hama and Aleppo, and more recently, a gathering has grown up on the coast near Latakia. UNRWA runs about 104 schools in these camps and has 26 clinics. However, during the course of the conflict, about 40% of classrooms have been destroyed. 40% of classrooms destroyed. As a result, UNRWA has turned to the Syrian government for assistance, and the Syrian government has set up in its own government schools second shifts so that the Palestine refugee children can get an education. And I have to say, this has been typical of the good treatment that Palestine refugees have received in Syria. I think most people would agree that that treatment has been better in Syria than any of the other host countries, be it Lebanon or Jordan or Egypt. We can go into the reasons for that later, but I'm just saying that the Syrian government have provided these extra education services.
Thank you very much. That's a great snapshot. Again, more questions I'm sure will come to you later. So now we'll turn to Dr. Faedah Totah. Dr. Faedah, in addition to the book you earlier wrote about urban preservation efforts in the old city of Damascus, you have conducted a number of studies of the lives of Palestinians in Damascus and elsewhere in Syria. Could you sketch out some of your most important findings, you know, in about 3 or 4 minutes, that is, and then perhaps start telling us what has happened to these Palestinians in Syria during the years of the current conflict?
Thank you. First of all, I want to emphasize, as the two previous speakers have said, that Palestinians in Syria have a unique situation. And as we see with Palestinians throughout the region, it depends on the policies of the host government and how they treated the Palestinian issue. It kind of reflected in how Palestinian refugees were treated. Another thing that I want to emphasize is that there are a lot more Palestinians in Syria than Palestinian refugees. You have a large number of Palestinians who are not registered, not because they weren't considered refugees by UNRWA, but because they came to Syria as a result of disruption in the region, like in the aftermath of the Black September in 1970 in Jordan. And so you do have a number of Palestinians who live in Syria and they're stateless, really stateless, with no IDs, no papers, no nothing, and they kind of fall into the cracks when it comes to humanitarian organizations. Unfortunately, I couldn't get an exact number of these Palestinians. So as Helena mentioned, I did work on the historic preservation of the old city of Damascus in the heady days of the 2000s, before the civil war started, and where the old city of Damascus was being promoted as a heritage cultural site, which brought renewed interest into the built environment as well as in the historic neighborhoods, including the Jewish quarter. The Jewish quarter in Damascus has a long history. Jews have been living in Damascus for over a millennia, but what ended up happening due to politics is that many of them fled. However, as a result of the Nakba in 1948, a large number of Palestinians were housed in the old city and in courtyard houses. Some of you may be familiar with the Damascene courtyard houses. They are several rooms that are not internally connected, surrounding an open space, the courtyard in the middle. So they were ideal for housing a large number of families in one house. So when I went to Damascus in the early 2000s, there was still a large, substantial Palestinian refugee population living in the old city. There existed an UNRWA center, and there was the Alliance school that had been taken over by UNRWA, and where Palestinians were going. So the idea was that Palestinians living in the historic old city were problematic, as Damascus was trying to become a tourist destination. You can't really have tourists and refugees living side by side. So when I started my research, there was some concern about the large number of Palestinian refugees still living in the old city, as the old city was becoming a cultural destination. And what's also interesting is that a lot of the literature doesn't really talk about Palestinians living in the old city. A lot of the emphasis is on Palestinians in the refugee camp, but as Waddah earlier mentioned, not all Palestinians in Syria live in refugee camps. Even the most famous of all camps, Yarmouk camp, which is also considered Asimat al-Shatat, or the capital of the diaspora, where you have a solid Palestinian presence, only 20% of the pre-war population was Palestinian. So even spaces that are considered to be refugee camps were predominantly inhabited by Syrians and not just Palestinians. And so the Old City also happens to be one of those areas where you had a concentration of Palestinians, but they're not really visible. People who actually live in Damascus and know that there are Palestinians in the Jewish quarter or in Hay al-Amin. Unfortunately, I've lost touch with a lot of the people that I was interviewing. They were elderly because I was really interested in their history in the Old City. So even when I was interviewing them 10 years ago, they were in their 80s and some were even in their 90s. And so many of them had passed away. However, and I haven't been able to go back since 2008, but what I've understood is that they're still living there. UNRWA still has a center there and it has converted it to offering more assistance because many of the Palestinians living in the Old City tend to come from modest backgrounds. And what's also interesting is that Hay al-Amin, even before the war, was considered to be one of the most diverse neighborhoods in the Old City, where in addition to Palestinians and the few remaining Jews who still live in Damascus, there was a substantial Armenian population as well as a Shia population. And so from what I also understand is now that there are more Shia living in the old Jewish quarter than before.
Fascinating. And I thought the little bit of conversation we had yesterday about Yarmouk camp being really a sort of upper middle class, or anyway, definitely middle class neighborhood was interesting, because I guess my experience of the refugee camps in Lebanon, for example, is, you know, the terrible overcrowding and just horrendous conditions of Shatila camp today or whatever. Let's move to the impact of the conflict on the Palestinian refugees in Syria. Waddah, could you speak to that a little bit?
Sure, I can begin from where you stopped talking about Yarmouk. Yarmouk was as our Palestinian friends in Lebanon would say, it was a five-star refugee camp in comparison. Yarmouk camp, the main population concentration of Palestinians in Syria, was completely devastated by the conflict, by the military actions. Initially, it was overtaken by Islamic fighters, and over the years, many people who lived in Yarmouk moved away from the camp to Damascus and to the Damascus countryside. And over the years, what we have seen is a steady flow of these people leaving Syria, mainly from what I know, to places like the Netherlands and Sweden and Europe in general. The camp itself now is almost uninhabitable. It's really tragic when you think about it. The main street of the camp, Shari al-Yarmouk, the stores in that street were as expensive to rent if you want to start a business or to buy as some very expensive areas in downtown Damascus. This is all gone. The people are gone. What we know is that naturally many of the refugees who were there had to leave very early on without any chance to get most of their belongings. And so we have a sense of people being completely deprived of not only their material possessions, but also of their memories in the camp. This is a camp that houses one of the largest cemeteries of any refugee camp, with also historic significance. Many of the leaders of the Palestinian national movement were buried in those cemeteries. Those cemeteries are completely destroyed today. The graves were completely destroyed. In some cases, we know that even the name on the names on the tombstones were completely defaced, or the tombstones themselves were stolen for reasons that are totally unclear to me. Now, the result is that, yes, we have a percentage, we don't know the percentage today, of Palestinian refugees in Syria who end up in Europe. Those of us who are still here have to struggle with our daily lives, I guess the same way that an average Syrian citizen struggles. But what Peter says is extremely important when we think about the continual displacement of the Palestinians of Syria. First of all, becoming IDPs, and then becoming IDPs again, and then moving outside the country. So that's the situation right now. I don't know that I answered your question.
I think you've answered quite a lot. Peter, could you actually speak a little bit, as far as you know, how easy is it for a Palestinian refugee in Syria to get to Europe? When Waddah makes it seem almost easy, but is it?
Well, as we look at the numbers, it seems relatively easy. I can't remember off the top of my head, but I think a majority of the Palestinians who have left Syria during the conflict have made it to Europe. Perhaps that's partly a function of them being well educated in UNRWA schools, but it's an observable fact that they I think roughly 50,000 have made it to Europe.
So what kind of travel documents do they have? They don't have a Syrian passport, but do they have a laissez-passer? How can they cross borders and so on?
Well, many have been boat people arriving very deliberately sans passeport. There must be many who made it through Turkey. Turkey has been turning a blind eye for years to the passage of anybody who appeared to be against the Syrian government. Many went by boat from Turkey, inevitably.
If I may step in here, just to clarify also, Helena, yes, it is a lot easier for a Palestinian leaving Syria to get refugee status in places like Germany, Sweden, and the Netherlands than for Syrians themselves. We have established stories, many narratives. I can think of cases that I know in Austria, where Palestinian and Syrian family who crossed Europe together to Austria and sought asylum there. The Palestinian family was, the paperwork for the Palestinian family was processed a lot faster than the Syrian family, by virtue of the fact that they have either a laissez-passer or just some proof that they're Palestinian refugees in Syria, the national ID or something like that.
But also, Waddah, perhaps you can clarify this. From my understanding, is that Palestinians in Syria from 1948 who are registered as refugees, and they fall under the law of 264, was it the law that gave them residency? Palestinians can travel on a Syrian passport, but it clearly states that they are Palestinian, right? So they have a passport.
Yes, I mean, it looks like the Syrian passport with a difference in the shade of color, and it specifically says that this is a traveling document for the refugees of Palestine. And so, yes, of course, before the war, I was able to use this document to travel to the United States, to get pursue my studies, to travel to Europe a lot, and come back to Syria. It was very easy if you were a Palestinian to get living in Syria with a job, to get a Schengen, or as Ambassador Ford remembers, for the many trips that we did to the UK as part of the Ministry of, with a team from the Ministry of Higher Education. So yeah, it's very easy to travel if you have a Syrian traveling document for the refugees than if you have an Egyptian one or a Lebanese one. The main reason for that is that Palestinians can leave Syria and come back to Syria without a re-entry permit. If you're a Lebanese, Palestinian refugee to Lebanon or to Egypt with Lebanese or Egyptian documents, and you leave Lebanon or Egypt, you cannot go back there without a re-entry visa to those host countries. So.
Right, and I believe some of the Palestinian refugees from Syria have actually ended up in Gaza. I don't know how that worked, but you read about a few of them. I mean, I don't know how they get there, maybe from Egypt via Rafah or...
My sister, my sister is one of them, yeah. But basically traveling to Egypt and then going through the Sinai Peninsula through Rafah into Gaza.
So she returned to Palestine?
Well, she got married to somebody from Gaza. My mother's side of the family is from Gaza, and she just went to visit through the Red Cross my late grandma, who was dying, and she met her future husband there, and so she moved back to Gaza.
Oh, how interesting. I'd like any of you to be able to explain for me what the kind of political trends are amongst the Palestinians who are in Syria today. Have some of them been fighting with the opposition? Have some of them been fighting with the government? Have some of them been determined not to get drawn into it? How does it break down?
Should I go? I don't. Okay. Yeah. Palestinians, I guess, like Syrians, have taken various sides in this conflict. There are Palestinians who are fighting with the forces of the Syrian government, with the Syrian army. There is the Jerusalem forces, as they're called, and there are a number of Palestinian refugees who started mainly in Aleppo, in the northern part of Syria, at al-Nayrab refugee camp. And this force is made up of Palestinian refugees in Syria who are fighting with the government. Others have taken the side of the opposition groups, the Islamic militants at times, especially the Hamas core that used to be in the Yarmouk camp. And yet a third group of Palestinians took either this is not my conflict type of attitude. I can't say that many, or at least of the people that I know, took that attitude or that position. And some just kind of refrained from just expressing any view on the conflict.
I think it's also important to point out that one of the conditions of Palestinians in Syria is that they do not interfere in domestic politics. And so they have to be the good, ideal refugees where they can engage in Palestinian politics as much as they want, as long as they do not interfere in Syrian domestic politics. And I think what happened in Yarmouk camp is a very good example of where their loyalty was being tested, both by the regime and by the rebel forces, where they were kind of forced to take a decision. But Palestinians are kind of caught in a catch-22, right? Where they're damned if they do and damned if they don't. I think that's like the tagline for Palestinians everywhere, is that it was very difficult for them to remain neutral, especially when their loyalty was constantly being tested, and especially after decades where their acceptance in society in Syria was to remain politically neutral when it came to Syrian domestic politics.
That's interesting. Yeah. I mean, it's hard for them being stateless. They are incredibly vulnerable wherever they are. I mean, Palestinians, whether they're in Lebanon or Jordan or wherever they are, they don't have a government that can, their own government, their own Palestinian government that can protect their interests. And, you know, that is the terrible dilemma, the terrible existential threat that Palestinians everywhere have. So it does make them very vulnerable, as you said, to being conscripted or, you know, tested by one side or the other. There is conscription for Palestinians into the PLA. Yes. Could you describe that a little bit?
Yes. Part of the package of being a Palestinian refugee, of getting free education, free health, being treated like a citizen, is that you have to serve in a division of the Syrian army called the Palestine Liberation Army, the PLA. Basically, you get military service equal to that of the Syrian, only for Palestinian refugees. Palestinian officers are in charge of those military bases and of the whole structure. Palestinian refugees in Syria also pay an additional tax that goes to funding the PLA. I mean, we pay taxes like Syrians, but we pay also what is called the PLO tax that appears on our paychecks always. Now, interestingly, during
the idea being that you would liberate Palestine, right?
Exactly. The idea is always that we will liberate Palestine. Interestingly, though, I mean, during the conflict, and beginning with, I think, 2012, when the government started drafting the reserve of the army, the Palestinians were excluded from that. So if you're a Palestinian who has done your military service in the Palestine Liberation Army before the conflict, you are not drafted for the reserve, which is something that some of our Syrian friends complained about, that we were not asked to or were not called to service again.
Interesting.
Can I jump in here and mention leadership? There was no really identifiable leadership of the Palestinian community in Syria, which was partly a reflection of how well integrated Palestinians were into the body politic of Syria. But also a reflection of the divisions, the political divisions among Palestinians. To some extent, Hamas assumed or tried to assume some leadership role, but during the time I was there, the Syrian government did not allow Hamas to carry out many political activities in the camps, because there was always an element of mistrust of Islamists and the Muslim Brotherhood and the groups, including Hamas, which had affiliations and sympathies with the Muslim Brotherhood. So you had this vacuum of power and influence in the Palestinian community, and they didn't know which way to turn when the conflict escalated.
That's a great point. And then the other big trend in Palestinian political life, Faedah and the PLO has kind of been on the outs with the government of Syria for a long time, since the 1990s. Though there are some historic Fada'i groups, guerrilla groups in the Palestinian movement that have had continuing relations with the government of Syria. Isn't that right?
Yes, the more nationalist, the more left-wing groups like the TFLP PFLP-GC, they remained loyal.
Yes, Faedah?
I think I just want to say something to what Peter was saying, is that in Syria, that was by design, because especially under Hafiz al-Assad, there was no tolerance for any kind of competition or opposition, and that's where we see that Palestinian groups who are allowed to operate have to be on the side of the Syrian government, right? So, and it wasn't like where you had a lot of leeway or freedom to do anything, because there wasn't a lot of freedom to act. And so Hamas, because they were against Oslo, because they were antagonistic to Fatah, made them more acceptable and more tolerable to the regime, right? And also there was that relationship that Hamas had with Hezbollah as a result of Israel expelling a lot of Hamas activists in the early 1990s to southern Lebanon, where they came in contact with Hezbollah. And also to Syrian operatives in Lebanon as well. So it is a very complicated relationship, and it kind of shifts from one period to another. And I believe you had a speaker on last week or something, where he talked about how the Palestinian issue has been completely marginalized within the current Syrian conflict. Like, nobody talks about it because the Syrians are kind of dealing with their own version of the Palestinian refugee crisis.
That's right. And back to what Peter was saying about Hamas and its relationship with the Muslim Brotherhood, I, for a long time, and maybe till now, think that there's a difference between Hamas and the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood, in that Hamas, accepted to take part in elections, which they did in Palestine in 2006, and did so in very good order, as attested to by Jimmy Carter and other international observers. And they won those elections. And then, as we know, they got slammed. They got really slammed. Whereas, and to a certain extent, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt was doing the same kind of thing, participating in elections, winning them and getting slammed, I should notice. But in Syria, I don't think the Muslim Brotherhood ever made that move toward participation in democratic life, partly because there was no, democratic life. But even when there were openings in Syria, some political openings, the Brotherhood, which was still based largely out of Syria, it was still very dedicated to violent overthrow of the government, which made it rather different from Hamas, although they had, a lot of ideological things in common. Is that roughly a good picture, Waddah?
Well, yes. First of all, the last participation of the Muslim Brotherhood in Syria in any political process goes back to the elections, to the parliamentary elections of 1954. When we have this famous parliament of Syria that managed to represent all the trends and currents in Syrian society at the time. They didn't fare very well in those elections. There were two kind of traditional conservative parties, the Shab and al-Watani in Damascus and Aleppo, who got the majority of voices in the elections. And then there were the Ba'athists, the Syrian nationalists, the Qawmi Suri, and the communists who fared well in those elections. The Muslim Brotherhood did not. And that was the extent of their participation in the political process in Syria. The other thing about the Muslim Brotherhood in Syria compared to other countries is that their discourse is often sectarian. This is something that we don't see with the Muslim Brotherhood in Palestine or in Egypt. The very nature, the very fabric of Syrian society is so diverse, and there's so many different sects and ethnicities and groups, that many Syrians have over the decades found the discourse of the Brotherhood, despite their opinion in the government or or whoever is running the country. But their focus on sectarian discourse has been often found by Syrians to be anything but attractive.
Great. Well, listen, this is amazing to have this rich discussion. I'm going to open it up now to questions from what you might call the floor, but we don't have a floor. So let's bring in Alice Rothschild. And Alice, thank you for once again doing the wrangling the questions for us. And if you could pick out a few great questions and possibly even tell us who's asking them.
Okay, so this is a question, why did Khaled Mashal had to leave Damascus? Were Palestinian refugees involved in anti-Assad activities?
Anybody?
Okay. Well, Khaled Mashal had to leave Damascus because he was asked to leave Damascus, I guess. Early on in the conflict, there was, to the best of my knowledge, there was a request from the Syrian government that Hamas tries through its connections with the Muslim or with the Islamists in Syria to broker some sort of at least peace or some sort of settlement. Hamas initially refrained from any kind of initiative in this regard. But not only that, I think we do have at this point ample evidence that Hamas contributed to the arming of some of the anti-government forces in Syria. And eventually Mashal had to leave the country. Now, Palestinian forces or Palestinians against or fighting against the government, yes, as I mentioned, we had groups, Aknaf Bayt al-Maqdis, one of them, that are of an extreme Islamist agenda, who fought against the forces of the government in Yarmouk camp and also in the camps around the city of Aleppo.
And this is a question about Black September. Were most of the refugees from Black September ferried by Syria on into Lebanon? No? The answer is no.
No.
I was actually in Lebanon in the mid-70s,
Yeah.
and there were a bunch of people who had been in the Palestinian guerrilla forces in Jordan who came to Lebanon. Some of them stayed in Syria, I know. I don't think anybody has quantified, you know, how many went to which place, but it's true. A lot of them came to Lebanon. Through Syria, yes.
Through Syria, okay. Would it be fair to say that, oh,
yeah,
go ahead.
It's important to note that many of them went to Lebanon because that's where they wanted to go. That's where there were other Palestinian armed forces. There were none in Syria, except those that were part of the Syrian army, but many of those Black September people wanted to go to join their fellow revolutionaries, fighters in Arafat's Beirut.
Okay. Would it be fair to say that Syrian Palestinians with money and contacts have a significant advantage over most other escapees from Syria, given the need to pay smugglers, document forgers, safe house operators, etc., between Syria via Turkey to Western Europe?
We just lost power in my neighborhood.
It looks very authentic, Waddah.
All I need is a couple of candles and, you know, whatever. I really have no answer to that. I don't know. I don't know whether Palestinians were privileged in the sense that if I get the question correctly.
I mean, I would say the answer would be that people who have money were able to do it more easily, whether they were Syrians or Palestinians. And it's probably not helpful to identify Palestinians with being richer. It seems like the kind of narratives told historically about Jewish people in Europe, you know.
But isn't that true of any rich people anywhere in the world? They always fare better, even in the coronavirus. If you're wealthier, richer, you can be on your yacht. And so, yeah.
Yeah, you can actually be in a room on your own, you know, as opposed to having 10 people in one room. So, yes.
There are a number of questions about the right of return. This is one: who is talking about the right of return in any practical way? Is it just a dream, or are some forces trying to figure out how it can be done?
Waddah, do you want to take this?
I definitely want to take this. I'm living in Syria like pretty much like a Syrian citizen. I have traveled the world. Perhaps I happen to be among the luckier Palestinian Syrians with education and perhaps with the work that I have. But I don't think anyone in the world has the right to question my right whenever I desire to return to Palestine. Now, how will this be done politically? What kind of dynamics will be at work to do this? I think this is a very complicated question, but initially, it's a basic human right that people who are displaced and their descendants from their homeland are entitled to go back to their homeland, period. I have a 4-year-old daughter who is the world to me, and I named her after my village in Palestine. And so it's just an expression. Whether I end up living in a palace in the Gulf, or in a chateau in France, or here in my modest apartment in Damascus, I want to have that right. And guess what? I think many Palestinians, if you give them, if you ask them that, will say, whether I will go or not, whether I return immediately on the first ship or plane or train or not, that's not the question. The question is, do I have that right when I decide to?
And I would like to add something to this, that since the signing of Oslo Agreement in 1993, there has been a massive right of return movement in Lebanon and in Syria, where a lot of Palestinians who have felt deserted and unaccounted for in the agreement, because the issue of refugees has not been brought up. It's still not brought up. Well, there's nothing going on between Israeli and Palestinians when it comes to the whole peace thing, or whatever they call it these days. So there has been more demonstrations, more calls, more emphasis that Palestinians are not going to give up their right of return. Now, as Waddah said, what form this is going to take, it needs to be seen, but there are activists on the ground in both Lebanon and Syria who insist on the right of return.
Okay. How has Hamas's attitude towards the Syrian conflict evolved, and what is it today?
Peter, do you want to come in?
Volunteer here. Hamas have been very torn. They were tempted to decamp to Qatar, which was giving them a lot of money. And I think the leadership have remained for now based in Qatar. But they have found that they've lost their role, and they have made overtures towards reconciliation with Damascus. And Damascus is listening, but in no hurry to reconcile with Hamas. But enter Iran. Iran, for wider regional reasons, it seems, would like Hamas to be somewhat rehabilitated. And so the Syrian government has been under some pressure from Iran to reconcile with Hamas. As far as I know, the situation is unresolved, but with most of the fighting over, the question has changed. I think all the Palestinian camps are now in the hands of the Syrian government, including Nayrab, which was recently recovered, the one near Aleppo. Going forward, it'll be very interesting to see how Hamas can rehabilitate itself in the eyes of Damascus. I don't think they can.
This is a question to Waddah. Did your sister move back to Gaza before the siege or after?
She has, she has moved to Gaza before the siege. She has lived throughout the siege. She left to Amman only a few months ago to visit her son and daughter who are studying at the Jordanian universities. But yeah, she moved from Syria and to Palestine, and she's been living through the hell of being in Gaza.
And did other Palestinians move from Syria to Gaza during the siege?
I don't have figures on that, but from the grapevine and from family and the community, I know that the percentage is very small. I mean.
And was it mostly for personal reasons, like a marriage, or?
Are not from Gaza.
I think the internet is not cooperating here.
So maybe you could find another question, send it to another.
Okay. This is a basic question. Can you explain what religions the Palestinian refugees are?
Okay. Can I volunteer for this one? Because I think this is a very good question. It's important to know that over 90% of Palestinians, whether they're in Syria or anywhere, are Sunni Muslims. And it's no accident that all the official camps in Syria were in predominantly Sunni areas. And that is also a reason why they have been battlegrounds. There are no Palestinian camps on the coast, except an unofficial, recently established gathering near Latakia. That's the predominantly Alawite area, none in the Druze areas, none in the Shiite areas, none in the Kurdish areas. And the Palestinians have inevitably been attracted towards the opposition because they also are over 90% Sunni. And well, I could go on because personally I see this whole conflict as a conflict for Sunni supremacy of Syria. But the Palestinians have been part of that.
I think I want to jump in a little bit and just note that there are a lot of Christian Palestinians in Damascus in particular, and maybe in Aleppo. And, those two cities are real centers of Arab Christian life. So, given that Christians are the only minority essentially in Palestine, apart from the Sunni majority, as you mentioned, that you do find a lot of Christian Palestinians in Damascus, and they, there's a very vibrant Orthodox and Armenian Christian life in that city to which they can relate.
But also to categorize the conflict in Syria as Sunni versus Shia kind of ignores the fact that there are a lot of Sunnis who are supporting the regime. And I think Palestinians were not really part of this whole sectarian conflict to begin with. And Palestinians, some of them may see currency in having a Sunni regime in Syria, but most of them, that's not their fight. That's not what they're interested in. So, yeah.
Okay, so if
congratulations, getting your lighting back. That's that's great.
Yeah,
Well, could I, sorry, just come back a
this is
little on that, because it's
power out anytime.
If I could reply to Faedah. Yeah, I take her point that on the government side, it's a mosaic of communities. But how many on the opposition side are not Sunni? I'll tell you, 1%. So one side in this conflict is monolithic, and the other is secular and has many Sunnis, as you say. But on the side of the so-called rebels, they are 99% Sunni. That means something.
If I may add also, I mean, the current government in Syria would not have lasted perhaps through this war were it not for also the support of the predominantly Sunni middle and upper middle class, and particularly in cities like Damascus and Aleppo. Also, the other thing is that the Syrian army is, people talk about the composition of the Syrian army. The vast majority of the soldiers and the officers in the Syrian army happen to be Sunni. I think it would be a bit oversimplifying the issue or the issues in Syria to think in terms of, just sectarian divisions and their role. And I agree with Peter. The one thing about the opposition that made many opponents of the government of Bashar al-Assad nervous is that it is the discourse of the opposition from early on, the actions of the opposition, all tilt towards a predominantly extremist version of Islamists, Sunni Islamists. I'm Sunni.
Certainly that is the case. That is the case now. I mean, at the beginning there may have been other trends in the opposition, but the hard men with the guns now who control everything are Wahhabists.
Yep.
And there's a comment that came through the chat from Dr. Hatim Kanaa, who's a physician who lives in Israel at this point. I grew up in Palestine and still live in the Galilee. I never was aware of the dichotomy of Sunni and Shia. I never knew to which I belonged. It was a non-issue. To add to the commentary here.
Yep.
Comments on that or just a statement?
Yeah. We can talk a lot about this, but perhaps not in this seminar.
I think we probably need to wrap this up now. It's been an amazing experience to be able to have Waddah and Peter and Faedah here and Alice on the West Coast answering the questions. We have 2 more sessions in this webinar series. Next Wednesdays will be on sanctions and their effects on reconstruction and public health in Syria. I actually just added in the public health today because obviously sanctions have an effect on public health, which is a huge part of reconstruction. So on Wednesday in that session, we're going to hear from Dr. Asa Sha'er and possibly another panelist. Next Saturday's session, which will be the last one in this current series, is currently being planned to cover the issue negotiations over constitutional reform in Syria. But in light of coronavirus and other developments, we may change that focus a little bit. As many of you know, as you leave today's session, which you can do by clicking the Leave Webinar button that's at the bottom of your screen, don't do that yet. Don't leave the webinar yet. When you do, Zoom will direct you to an evaluation form where you can provide your feedback on this session. This time we have a question in the evaluation form in which we ask for your input into what you'd like us to address in that last session of the series next Saturday. Please do tell us your ideas and preferences for that and fill out the rest of the evaluation form as well. Also, today's session, like the preceding 7, has been recorded. We are building a permanent zone on our website where we're posting the links to all the videos and the related materials from this amazing collection of webinars we've been having, so that this can be a continuing educational resource on Syria for people going forward. Oh, I need to share a screen. As you know, I'm not very good at this, but here we go. Okay. Now this is my, okay. You can access our Growing Syria resource page by going to that first URL there. Keep checking back as we load more material onto it and as we get it better organized. As you know, now this is where I always lose. Oh, okay, there we go. We have been providing this whole webinar series at no cost to attendees. So if you find the project worthwhile, please send us as generous of a donation as you can. I want to thank the many people who have already given to us to support this project. If you have not yet done so, you can make a secure donation online or by check by clicking on the donate button on our website, which is www.justworldeducational.org. I want to thank all of you who've been with us on this learning adventure today, including all of the attendees and participants, our Super ELF team, and of course, our 3 great panelists. Ambassador Peter Ford, thank you so much for being with us.
It's been a pleasure.
And Dr. Faedah Totah, thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
And finally, Dr. Waddah al-Khatib there in Damascus, battling so many things that the rest of us don't have to battle, but doing a fabulous job. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to talk to you again, Helen.
So thanks everybody for being with us today. All of you at home, stay safe and be sure to join us for Wednesday's session on the issue of sanctions and their effects on reconstruction and public life in Syria. Until Wednesday, goodbye.